So we're going to talk about the biosphere, and who's going to do that talk now is Jacques van der Merwe, and he's got 5 bullet points of his career. Researcher at the Sonbona Wildlife Reserve in the Little Karoo from 2007 and 2008. Conservation and Tourism Manager for the Kloof and Burgerspost Wine Estate for a couple of years thereafter. A Conservation Manager for the Cape West Coast Biosphere, that is here in 2013 and 14. Then he became Stewardship Manager for the City of Cape Town for 5 years, 2014 to 19, and he's presently busy with Biodiversity Network Coordinator for the City of Cape Town. So let me introduce to you then Jacques van der Merwe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Can everybody hear me? Let me just lift this thing up a little bit. Oh, that's the wrong way around. There we go. Okay. So figure out this clicker thing here. Okay. Good morning. As you heard, I don't work for the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve anymore, but I used to, and it was one of the nice opportunities that I had in my lifetime to work for the NGO and do the amazing work that the Biosphere gets to do. So today I'm going to look a little bit at what the Biosphere has been doing for the past 21 years, and also just what the hell is a Biosphere Reserve. So a lot of people hear it but don't really understand what it is and where it fits into the landscape. So the first half is a little bit about where does it come from, how many Biosphere Reserves there are, and then we move into the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve, which is the one we're sitting in right now. So the first slide is the West Coast National Park, the Postberg section taken a little bit earlier this year, and just shows the amazing biodiversity and the flowers and the tourism potential that we have here on the West Coast. So coincidentally, the Man and Biosphere program is also 50 years old this year, so there's 2 celebrations in one go. And where do biospheres come from? So biospheres fall under UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, which is a rather large organization through the United Nations. And there's a global network of biosphere reserves. At the moment, there's about 727 biosphere reserves in, I think, 134 countries. There's a map next. And the idea with a biosphere reserve is that it's a global learning place for sustainable development, and there are 3 primary objectives. So firstly, the conservation of biodiversity, then socioeconomic development, so how do you mix the two, biodiversity conservation and socioeconomic development, and then we also need to include learning, so learning through monitoring, learning through research, education and training. Biosphere reserves, new biosphere reserves, are nominated by their national governments. So in our case, it falls under the Department of Environmental Affairs, and they are nominated to the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Program, and they are promulgated by the Director of UNESCO, or the Director General of UNESCO. There's a map of where all the biosphere reserves are. It kind of started off more in Europe, and the African biosphere reserves and the Australian and South American biospheres came a little bit later. So now we know how a biosphere reserve is established. So the next question is, what does it actually do? So a biosphere reserve is not a nature reserve like we typically understand it. It's more of a landscape tool which implements for sustainable development. All biosphere reserves follow this same course. So it has a core area, which is a provincial nature reserve or a national park. In our case, we've got the West Coast National Park as a core in the north, and we've got the Dussenberg Coastal Catchment Partnership, where I work, in the south, and in the buffer areas in between. And the buffer areas are essentially the areas where you try and work out a balance between sustainable development and nature conservation. So it's typically tourism-based development. So grazing areas for agriculture. So where you have a balance between, there's a little bit of nature, but there's also some economic development. And then finally, you've got your transitional area, and so this is where the towns and your more intense development is. And it's been a nice model, and it's worked quite well over the last 20 or last 50 years. So then the 700 biosphere reserves are grouped by 2 classifications. So one is by region, so the ones that are closer to each other can work together. And in Africa, we've got AfriMab, which is established in '96. And then the Arab states has the ArabMab in 1997. And then the East and the Pacific, there's a whole bunch of groups there. It's about 4 different groups. And Europe and North America, which is quite an interesting one because they're actually separated by quite a bit. And then Latin America, the Caribbean, Portugal, and Spain. So that is the next grouping. But these are region-based. And there's a little highlight of what biosphere reserves we get in the world. So it's typically around some of the most important natural features that we have in the world, and there's a biosphere reserve around them. Then they are also grouped by themes, which are ecological themes, because that's kind of what brings biosphere reserves together. So drylands, which is more your deserts, mangroves, which is the exact opposite, your tropical regions mixing by the sea. And then the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve falls in the marine, coastal, and island areas group. And you've also got the mountains, so Kogelberg and Cape Winelands would fall under the mountains, for example. And then savanna, your tropical forests, and wetlands. So national context, in South Africa, we have 10 biosphere reserves. The first one was Kogelberg, which was established, I think, in 1998. And the last one was Mariku, or the Groot Mariku, which was in 2008. And each of these biosphere reserves are managed a little bit differently all over the world, but in South Africa, we try and maintain them as NGOs, or more specifically, not-for-profit companies. So they are independent legal entities, so which has their own structures and municipal and their own financial structures, independently of government. But the national reporting is done by Department of Environmental Affairs to UNESCO. So these different NGOs report to the national government, who then report to UNESCO. And this is a map of where our biosphere reserves are. So down in the Cape, we've got fynbos. So we've got 5 biosphere reserves protecting our fynbos. And in the north, you're looking at the Kruger, you've got your water catchment areas, you've got real culturally significant areas up in the north. And mountain catchments like the Mariku is a mountain catchment for the Orange River, for the Vaal River, and the Limpopo River, all in one biosphere reserve. So these are really important areas. You've got the Cradle of Humankind is captured in a biosphere reserve. You've got the Drakensberg. You've got the Kruger National Park is captured by 2 separate biosphere reserves. And these like Vembi up in the north, is sitting on the boundary between Botswana and Zimbabwe. So it stretches into more than one country as well. Now, getting to the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve. So 21 years, a lot has happened in the last 21 years, and I can look back on all these other projects that we've had, like the Industrial Development Trust and AfriSam project and the Groensebenza. But I figured for today, let's focus on what the Biosphere Reserve is currently doing. So as a reflection of what the Biosphere Reserve has been doing over many years. And one thing that sets the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve apart from many of the other biosphere reserves in the world is mostly through actual implementation on the ground, where a lot of biosphere reserves are used as a landscape tool for sustainable development and planning. The Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve actually implements quite a significant amount of their time and investments in projects. So when I was at the Biosphere Reserve, we were the 6th biggest implementing biosphere reserve in the world. And at that time, there was about 600 and something. So which says quite a bit. Just the NRM project employed over 200 people at the time. Which is makes a real big change, or makes it different from other biosphere reserves in the world. So from the map on the right, you can see what our biosphere reserves look like. So West Coast National Park in the north, and the DCCP in the south, and the buffer and transitional areas. So as the biosphere was established 21 years ago, it's 21 years old, it was established in 2000. So I spoke a little bit about the fact that it's a not-for-profit company, and there are 2 reasons why it's a not-for-profit company. So the first one is, if you're a not-for-profit company, you don't pay income tax, so which is nice. So you can get grants from different government departments, you don't have to pay tax on it, so it's a very lean structure in terms of your funding. So also donations are tax deductible, so if you're getting donations from private funders, they can get that little tax certificate from the Biosphere Reserve, and they can use that donation as a tax-deductible benefit for their organization. So it's a nice funding model for the Biosphere Reserve. So the Biosphere Reserve is made up of a bunch of directors. and each one have their own portfolio based on their particular skill set. All the directors in the biosphere are voluntary, so they don't get paid, and you can see the list of what the different portfolios are. And then in terms of staff at the moment, so there's an office administrator and a projects coordinator. So and as the projects come on, so if there's a need for additional staff as part of that project, then they will employ additional staff. And when the next project comes, so it chops and changes a little bit, but those are sort of the structures that have stood out over time, over the 21 years. So one of the big projects that the Biosphere has always been involved with is environmental education and awareness. So at the moment, the Biosphere Reserve runs 2 swap shops, so one in Middelpost in Saldanha and the other one in Langville in St. Helena. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard, or if you guys know what a swap shop is, if you've heard of the concept. It's a very nice model for recycling. And essentially, the basis of it is that the kids go and collect recyclable materials, and I mean, about 80% of the waste that we produce is recyclable. And the kids collect all these recyclable materials, and they bring them through to the swap shop. So, and based on the weight of that material, they then get a point allocated to them for their daily collection or their weekly collection. And they can either build up their points over time in a book, or they can go to the swap shop with their ticket for 20 points, and they can get something off the shelf for that 20 points. And it could be anything from stationery. We try and stay away from the unhealthy things, but there are little snacks and things like that. So books and stationery, and it goes, and so the more you build up your points, the bigger prizes you can get. And one of the biggest prizes is a mountain bike. And obviously a lot of the kids are very keen in mountain bikes. And I can remember when I was working with a Darling swap shop, so there was one of these kids that already had his 3rd mountain bike. And he was kitting them out with a little roof, little racks in the back where he can put his recycling, and he drives through town. He collects like every bit of recycling, and everybody was very, very jealous of him. And he was only 10 years old, so it also learns him to develop those particular skill sets. In the Saldanha area, there's about 50 kids involved in the swap shop at the moment, but it keeps growing. And the thing that makes swap shops work is the fact that you have donations coming in from the public. So you need those gifts and those books. So the recycling that gets sold, there's some income generated from that, and you can use that for the swap shop. But generally, it's not a huge amount of money that comes in. So they are very dependent on donations from the community for books and prizes that the kids can win. So those donations are always very welcome. And if anybody wants to get involved in it, so right at the end of the slideshow, I will give the details, and people can get involved in the swap shops if they want. So it's a really great initiative, and it works really, really well. There's a picture of the swap shop. And you can see the amount of material that is collected by the kids in a relatively short period of time. And it makes a really big difference. Again, I can remember from Darling, they cleaned up the streets entirely. Sort of about 2 days before the swap shop opened, the kids are just going out and they collect absolutely everything. And it made a really big difference just in terms of the health and the look of the town in the poorer areas. Another nice, not an initiative from the Biosphere, but something that promotes the Biosphere quite well, was the SA Mint, and they produce this line of coins every single year. And they have a different theme every year. And for 2 years, they were focusing on Biosphere reserves. And in 2016, they focused on the Kogelberg Biosphere Reserves. In 2017, it was the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve, where they produced these specific set of coins. And they've got the printed color on the coins, and it's really, really nice. And the idea is to try and pick the charismatic species, natural species from the Biosphere Reserve. So in this case, the blue crane, and the black-headed heron, the Ferraria crispa, the spider lily, and that little yellow flower in the middle, that's Geiseriza darlingensis. It's flowering in the Darling Tiniversveld Nature Reserve at the moment, and it's endemic to that one site. So there's only one site with about 300 plants, and that's it for that entire species. So it's a very charismatic species, and and the coins do really well. So if you're interested if you're collecting coins, you can go and collect. You can go and buy a set of Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve coins. Then some of the bigger projects, the Natural Resource Management Project. So I was also quite intimately involved in that project when I was at the Biosphere Reserve. And what's nice about the NRM projects is it is an amazing tool for job creation, for restoring of natural ecosystems, but also developing skills in your local community. And it does that on a relatively large scale. The focus areas have always sort of been up in the north and down in the south, where your invasive species are more of a significant problem. And it also focuses around your poorer communities. In the south, Atlantis, Marmara, Riverlands, Chatsworth, and Darling. And in the north, it's sort of the outskirts of Langebaan, Saldanha, St. Helena Bay. Okay, so the first project started back in 2012, and it was a rough one. So it was a very steep learning curve initially, but after a while we got the grips of it, and it worked really well. And the current project, or the project work in 3-year phases. So the current project is a 3-year project for 1.5 million rand, and employs about 72 people, 2,300 hectares of initial clearing. That is an enormous amount of land that has been cleared of invasive alien species, and this is mostly on private land, so some of it is in municipal nature reserves, and 1,000 hectares of follow-up clearing. So you can't just do the initial clearing and then you're done. So there's a lot of little things coming up again afterwards. You need to sustain that follow-up clearing afterwards in order for that ecosystem to get a kickstart again and get going again. There's a map of where it is. You can see the focus area up in the north and the focus areas down in the south. So down in the south, we had a really big issue with Port Jacksons. So it completely grows over the entire area. It's 100% dense, and it just chokes everything underneath it. So this project is really nice in restoring those natural ecosystems. And the further south you go, closer towards Cape Town, also the more threatened the ecosystems become. So there's a lot of effort in the more critically endangered systems and restoring that Atlantis Sand, Fynbos, Renosterveld, Cape Flats, Dune, Strandveld vegetation types. This is just a little aerial picture of what it looks like afterwards. So all the work is done by professional contractors who go through a rigorous training regime, and the results speak for themselves. And then one of the commercial projects of the Biosphere Reserve is the Biosphere Trails. So these are slack packing trails, so it's nice and easy. You get a lift to where you start your walk for there. There's a couple of different trails, some of them are walks. You get a lift to where you're going to walk, and you only take what you need for the day, and you get picked up again in the afternoon. Your lunches and your suppers and your accommodation and everything is sorted out in the process. So it started back, when was it? About 2010, I think, with the Development Bank of South Africa, where they developed a business plan for it. And the business plan was then submitted to the National Lottery, who gave the initial funding to start up the trails, who employed the first people and laid out the trails and built up the partnerships with the service providers from the various areas. And there are 4 trails, as I said, and they generally they're not very difficult, so some of them are quite long trails to walk, but it's broken up quite nicely, and basically anybody can do it. If you're an amateur botanist or just an international tourist, so anybody can do these trails. And it's very easy, and everything gets taken care for you, and you've got a guide that is very knowledgeable in the area who explains everything to you as you go. Here are some pictures of what trails look like. So September is obviously a very nice time of year to be doing these. The first trail is Eve's Trail. It's a 2.5-day trail through the West Coast National Park, where you go and visit at Geelbeek. You go and visit the Eve's footprints, and it's a nice beach walk, and you walk through some portions of the national park in the Strandveld and your Fynbos vegetation types. The second one is the Darling Stagger, which is a little bit more relaxed, less walking. You're walking through the granite hills in the Renosterveld between Darling and Kwatu, where you go and visit some of the wine farms and some of the olive farms and do wine tasting and talk to some of the more interesting characters that live in the area. So there's some more pictures of what the trails look like. And then the 5 Bay Trail, that is between Jacques Bay and Paternoster. There are these 5 amazing, pristine beaches where people can walk. And again, you get picked up by your accommodation in the morning, get taken to where the trail starts, and you take this amazing scenic walk along these pristine beaches where almost nobody gets to go, with your guide, who then picks you then up again on the other side and takes you back. And then for those that are a bit more adventurous, so you can take the Wheels of Time. So it's a mountain biking trail, but it's the more proper roads, also over 3 days. where you can drive between the Marmara Mission Station and Darling on the first day, sort of the fossil in the West Coast National Park for the second day, your fossil trail, and then Eiserfontein to Quatu, which is another very nice through the Sandveenbos, through the Strandveld, and it's different landscapes for every single day, so it changes quite nicely. So you get to see the full extent of what the West Coast has to offer in terms of its natural landscapes. And then finally, so if anybody is interested in becoming a member, so people can be members of the Biosphere Reserve. So there's individual memberships, there's family memberships, and there's institutional memberships, and also commercial memberships. So, and if it's a commercial organization that we should make a donation, again, you can get, that can be a tax-deductible donation. And the Biosphere always needs some help with the implementation of their projects. So finally, remember, the 3rd of November is the new International Biosphere Reserve Day. And there's the contact details for the Cape West Coast Biosphere Reserve if you want to get in touch with them. And thank you very much.